Good morning, everyone, and certainly from the talk around the room, there's a real degree of optimism coming forward. And I also want to thank Chris and the DCM group. When we talk about passion in aged care and retirement living, there's no more passionate people than Chris. And Chris has done this a lot on his own cost and got the team together. So I'm going to talk today about the task force a little bit. Everyone's wanting to hear about the task force. Let's just go back one slide. Well, let's just talk about that task force. It actually had a lot of its genesis this year, one year ago, when we met with representatives from the Minister's Office, their senior advisor, and they'd heard about Plan B. Everyone had been hearing about Plan B and what consumer contributions mean. And they went and had lunch with us and said, how are we going to get moved forward? So we talked about a task force as being an independent area to move forward. And I think that was really important, and that was, as I said, the genesis of what the task force was. Then through the Minister's Office, they asked if I'd be on the task force. And I said, well, there's two things. If it's one where government's already got policy in mind, and the task force is just going to go through the motions to agree with what the government's policy is going to be, no thank you. I haven't got the time or the energy. If it's going to be a task force with a blank sheet of paper and we're going to work from there, then obviously I'm your person, knowing that any brickbats can be thrown at the task force. So that showed the government's view, I think the strong view, that we do want to progress this conversation about increased contributions, and a recognition that the residential sector, and in fact the home care as well, was underfunded. And how do we get more funding in? And generally you can only get it from two ways. You get more taxes, taxpayer funded, or we can get it through proper equitable consumer contributions. And that was a fairly clear charter. So what the task force wasn't concerned with was, for example, workforce. Workforce is very important, but it wasn't part of our charter. It's a conversation absolutely in its own right, and we need to be keeping that front and centre. I also said that the early days of the task force, let's not get caught in this question of what makes care and direct care. We've got a pricing authority, and Mike Baird mentioned, I think, how important the pricing authority is, and we need to support it in every way. And its charter is to say what constitutes the funding for direct care in all forms of aged care, not just residential. And they need to look at what the inputs, and hopefully they'll also be looking what constitutes different service delivery and how do we get funded for that. So I think that's important when we look at it, that the pricing authority, we didn't want to overlap with what they were doing. Fairly early in the piece, we disregarded a levy. So then we could now focus, which is important because we've all been on committees where you've got so many different items and agenda items, you never actually achieve any. We're able to narrow this down to, let's say, let's talk about consumer contributions, let's talk about equity. So these are just some of the 23 recommendations. Now, the task force, like any group, still needs to be challenged. The report needs to be challenged, we need to look at it critically, and we need to look through. So it's not just a fait accompli. I'm challenging everyone to say, what more, if we're looking at those were the charter for the task force, to look at consumer contributions, we've got 23 recommendations, what's missing? Now, the report, in a sense, was missing detail. And I mentioned this at the task force, one of the meetings, is that everyone's going to say, well, this sounds good, but what's it mean? What's it mean for the sustainability of the sector? What's it mean for the consumer? And we've done some work on that and released some modelling on that last Friday. I think that's important. But it's really important to say the key areas, the recognition of the importance of in-home care going forward, the recognition that we're always going to have residential aged care, the recognition that we always have a safety net, the recognition that the current, I think, MMM classifications is not working, that we need to review those classifications because people in MM facilities or homes in MM3 and MM4 are clearly disadvantaged. A recognition that we've got to have equity, and a recognition that consumers should co-contribute to the areas of care that they have. So that was our fundamental principles. So of course, I think what we could say is what's missing, because what's missing as far as enshrining them is going to be important. Now, I would say there's nothing missing because I was part of it, but it was an independent task force chaired by the Minister, but independent. We said 16 members. But of course, I had the easy job because many of these recommendations, you're probably aware, I've been saying for 3 or 4 years. StewartBrown have been advocating them for 3 or 4 years. So it's no surprise when they came up that I was the champion of many of these ones in the task force. But we still had to have that critical discussion at all members, and it was diverse, the task force, and everyone had very strong input. It was actually a pleasure, supported by the Secretariat, supported by the Department Secretariat, the Task Force Secretariat, who were very on lend. So why are we this position? I love graphs. As we know, data seems to dominate my world, which is good, is that if we look at the blue line there, that's the accumulated aggregate results of residential aged care. That's the accumulated, which are all losses. As you can see, they've got brackets and they've got red. That's losses. So if we add those through, including the projection for this year, which will be another small loss, that's $5 billion with the residential aged care sector. Now, we all hear that providers are putting cash, profits before, care, but where does the money go? Well, what residential aged care, every approved provider has to send in an audited set of accounts, but also an aged care financial report, which is attested to by the directors or by the heads of the governing body. Legal issues. So it's not like that we're suddenly money's floating. We know exactly how the sector is going. And of course, at StewartBrown, we get at much more granular level, so we can look at all the reasons. So that's why the task force. Now, the green line, of course, is cash EBITDA. Now, I'm not a big fan of EBITDA because I think it does take depreciations non-cash, but building is so important. We should be looking at a 25-year turnaround. I think depreciating at least 4%, because 25 years will be a different standard of care. So the task force wasn't looking at how do we remedy it next year. We're wanting to see how we're remedying it in 5 to 10 years. So let's have a look at the performance. If I express it in dollars per bed day, that line is the same as the blue line you see, that how did the residential aged care perform in dollars per bed day. And we can see we made a slight surplus, we'll look at in September, but losses for all those periods. So where do they occur? The blue line, that's your direct care. That's your subsidy for direct care. That's ACFI and ANAC, less all of the costs associating with providing direct care. Guess what? We've been making a surplus in that forever. Ever since the funding came in, we've made ACFI surpluses. They've reduced, we've now made ANAC surpluses. Now, of course, this is the conundrum. If we make a surplus on direct care, should that surplus be used in other segments of the business? Or we're getting taxpayer funded for direct care, we should be using it for direct care. So that margin will start to decline. We've got a transition benefit, but it's still positive. Because in Australia, 96% of funding for direct care comes paid for by the taxpayer in residential and 98% in home care. So that I've paid taxes all my life, why should I pay for care? Well, as a matter of fact, you're not. The taxpayer is paying for it. The Royal Commission said there should be no means-tested care fee. We've got very low levels of means-tested care fee now. That's a good thing. That says Australia, actually quite apart from most of the rest of the world, that the taxpayer funds for your direct care. But the next line is everyday living. That's your catering, cleaning, laundry, utilities. We're losing money. We've always lost money. We haven't recouped the cost of providing those services. So that's a problem. Where else in the world do we expect to pay for less than what the cost is? What other sector? I can't go to Bunnings, buy a shovel and say, I'm only going to pay 80% of it. The taxpayer to pay the other 20%. We look after the vulnerable. So everyday living is something we're able to focus on, something I've focused on, as you know, for many years. How do we improve that? And then I look at the next line, accommodation. How important is accommodation? And what's going to happen? We've got the boomers coming. It's going to be, since aged care in Australia started, we've had one cohort, the frugal generation. People have come through a war, come through a depression, several things that people are setting aside. The ATO says people receiving the pension as their only source of income, the pension, they're only spending 80% of it. They're putting aside 20% of the pension, and that's their only source. That's the frugal generation. In 5 years' time, 50% will be boomers. In 10 years' time, 100%. So I'm a boomer. So what do boomers want? We're happy to spend. But we will spend when we get a service and a delivery of service and a style of accommodation that we want. We won't spend when told this is what you're getting. We'll quibble, we'll argue. So aged care is going to go through the first major generational shift of behaviour. And we've got to make certain that we've got a funding instrument and understanding. Because the boomers, when they come in, it won't be a revenue side cycle problem. It'll be, are we giving the service delivery, be it in-home care or be it in assisted living or be it in residential care that we're getting. So this is a big challenge for providers. It doesn't start to shop, it starts today to get ready for that generational change which we had never seen before in the aged care sector. And so accommodation is going to be a big part of it, as well as our care service delivery. So that's why we focused not on ANAC, not on direct care. We focused on what's happening in everyday living and what's happening in accommodation. So the recommendations of the task force that we'll put down to 3 or 4. So let's just talk about everyday living. It's an equity. The cost of providing it, let's call it $80 a day. And that's about the average cost. As we know, we've got detailed surveys. Every resident, irrespective of their means, pays $61 basic daily fee. Then we've got a thing called the hotelling supplement, which we started off in the Royal Commission. I talked about it. That's a taxpayer, was $10, now $10.92 per person. Everyone. So if I've got the means, the taxpayer's subsidising me for $10.92 when I've got the means to be paying for what it costs. I think that's inequitable. If I haven't got the means, obviously and clearly we want the taxpayer to subsidise that. But we're still short. So what this recommendation is, if we say basic daily fee is $80 or the cost of everyday living is $80, we're getting the basic daily fee of $61, just using today's figures, we're $19 short. So if they're supported resident, we pay the $19. If we're not a supported resident, I pay the $19. As I should, because the cost is $80. I shouldn't be getting taxpayer funded. And remember, this is not a means testing, that's a graded means testing, like the means tested care fee. It's not that if I'm just on the means, I pay $80. If I've got more wealthy, I pay $82, or more wealthy than that, $85. No, it's a simple yes, no. Am I a supported resident? Yes, then the taxpayer pays it. Am I not a supported resident? No, then I pay it the same amount. And of course, we've got additional services above that. By implementing that change, where we're going to get more from the consumers for that area, it represents about $560 million a year into the sector. And that's just recouping what we saw before, what we're not recouping now. The next one is retentions. Now there is this, what goes around comes around. Did we have retentions? Yes, we had them before, but that was a retention and accommodation bond, which is about $320 a month. And of course, that flew in the face of what ACFI was doing to get more people, more providers to take more highly acute. Because in those days, people would take lower care residents, we call them, put in a hostel, get an accommodation bond, get a small retention, nursing home or high care got no retention. A whole different world. We had to change that cycle. And I think Ian Yates was part of, I think, the right area of saying that's not working by getting more acute people into residential aged care. But now, of course, everyone who comes in has opportunity of paying a RAD or a DAP. But it's inequitable. If I've got $500,000 as being an accommodation price, and I haven't got the means, I've got to pay a daily accommodation payment, soon to be 8.34%, currently 8.38%. That's what I'm paying for it. But if I've got the means, and I pay $500,000, or the family has, it's only my opportunity cost. I could put in a term deposit, then I'd have to pay tax on the interest of the term deposit. If I kept it in the family home, it's likely to have gone up by more that amount. So if I pay a RAD, then I'm virtually getting very low rental. And it is rental. That's all we're doing. We're renting our room. So that's inequitable between the consumer, clearly inequitable. So what this is bringing it slightly closer. Yes, we need that retention when you pay a RAD so we can set it aside using it for renewal, replacement, refurbishment of buildings and to improve the overall sustainability of the sector. But it's actually not that relevant. It also gets the gap between paying a RAD and a DAP from the consumer point of view to much more equity. Now, the department did some research, or got some research done. We said, why 3%? And 3%, the research, which I think was fairly extensive, said it won't change consumer behaviour. That people will still make a decision on a RAD or a DAP as they're doing today. That's a good thing. If we said 6%, then that would change consumer behaviour and we'd see more people wanting to take the DAP option. By putting that in, what's it going to mean? $637 million more goes into the sector every year. Now, I might add there's a 3-year phasing in period. Don't spend it all today because all current residents and current people in home care are grandparented. So it's going to take 3 years because of the rollover. But this is what we're going to get, which is really important. Now, the next one, which is probably the contentious one for the government point of view, is the accommodation supplement. That's a supplement that supported resident gets for accommodation. It's too low. It's about $66 a day. If you base it on a $450,000 accommodation price at 8%, that comes to $98 a day. Now, if we're going to have an equitable system, we don't want to have a supported person and one that means making a distinction. We want to accept everyone into aged care. And we want to make certain that they're getting exactly the same services. So we're putting it on to the government to say we need to increase the accommodation supplement. And that's what and I think, we will work hard because I think that's only equity. And the other thing, of course, is the maximum permitted interest rate, a term I do not like, is effectively the cost of capital, the weighted average cost of capital, because what's it there for? It's for your build, your accommodation. Should never have got below 8%. It went down to about 4% because they tagged it against interest rates. It's got nothing to do with interest rates. When interest rates went down, housing prices went up 80%. So let's look at it what it is. It's a weighted average cost of capital. And if we kept it at that 8% level the last 3 years, it would have been another $10 per bed day. And for the residents coming in, it's going to represent another $600 million. Consumer contribution, this is important, but we're just recouping it. So these are important steps we're advocating. So what's it mean? Is this going to make the residential care sector sustainable? Well, if we look at the FY28 on the right-hand side, that's what it's going to look like after the phasing in period. So the blue is if we do nothing. All recommendations are rejected, we do nothing. That's unsustainable. We'll see providers and homes close. The green is if the government doesn't come to the party with the accommodation supplement. So we get the retention, we get the extra for your everyday living, and we got the DAP maintaining the interest rate well above 8% or above, and that comes to $3.2 billion a year aggregate. That's about $17,000 EBITDA per bed average. Yeah, we're sustainable. But if we get the beige line, that's including the government coming up with the accommodation supplement, that's $4.2 billion a year aggregate. That's about $22,000 a bed EBITDA. Wouldn't we like to get that? The financial institutions told us in meetings that anything above 12,500 with good occupancy is a really good start to get them interested. So this is a lot more than that. So suddenly we change the environment all around. So are we going to get the Mercedes or the Maseratis and the Lamborghinis? No, because it still is a long-term investment. So this is a little chart to say if everything comes through, how do we compare to listed private health insurers like Ramsay Health and the likes of that? And you can see we're still only going to be half, or maybe a bit more than half, of the same return on capital equity that they're getting. That's fine, they're listed entities, but it just means, again, we're sustainable but we're going to be sustainable, not at the expense of profits just leaving the sector. They'll be remaining in the sector because it's long-term investment. So what does this mean from a consumer? That's the other side of the argument. So we've got the current and the proposed. So if we look at direct care, that's ANAC, direct care, no change. The government's paying 100% of that if you're supported, and currently about 96% if you're unsupported. So these recommendations haven't touched that. Great thing for Australia. Everyday living, if you're paying the basic daily fee, no change. Everyone still pays the basic daily fee. If you're a supported resident, the government was paying $11, but now they'll pay $19. Now, I might add, the government actually saves about $150 million because if they pay supported residents with the same bucket today, it's about $24 a bed. So if you're non-supported, you're paying $19 more. But you're only paying for the cost. Again, you're paying for the $80 it costs. Then if we look at the accommodation, supported residents currently getting $67 a day accommodation supplement. We think it should be $98, but no change for them. If you're paying a DAP, no change. It's exactly the same. Now, if you're paying a RAD, currently, that $57, that's your opportunity cost. That's a real cost if you're paying a RAD, $57 a day by investing it and after interest. Compare that to the $126 of a DAP. That's the inequity. With a 3% retention, that's about $45 a day additional. So this is not a huge additional impost on the consumer. And if you add the 57 and the 45, that's $102 compared to $126 if you're paying a DAP. So it's still a cheaper form of rental, but allows providers to then work with the consumer to pay a RAD or a DAP, but you've still got to have that coming through. So far, I'm not seeing any great issues here. We're saying pay for what you've paid for all your lives. It's not a wealth tax. It's just I've got the means to pay for it. In home care, slightly different. Home care's only got 82% of all the funding received per person is being utilised. It's got virtually no consumer contribution, no contributions to care. So if we look at in home care, we're going to have, say, 3 streams as an example. Clinical care stream, independent safety stream, and a everyday living. So where should consumer contributions go to there? Well, if we follow the same line for clinical care, that the taxpayer pays for it like in residential, no consumer contribution for the clinical care portion. But the independence and safety, I think there should be a consumer contribution, as there should be, and of everyday living, a greater percentage of consumer contribution because you're paying for the cleaning and the maintenance yourself all your lives. So we've got to change home care by saying, rather than getting no consumer contribution, or very little, like about 2%, let's say we've got full consumer contributions. That will add $1 billion a year into the home care package funding. Now, we're not using it today, we've got unspent funds, but we can use it in the future because that, plus the $3.2 billion worth of unspent funds, will alleviate a lot of the list now where we've got people being assessed for home care and they're not receiving it. So home care has got to be about consumers co-contributing, using it for everyday living services and lifestyle, not for your clinical. Add to the funding bucket and let us as a community know that we've got to co-contribute to our care. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Grant. Does anybody have any questions for Grant? No? Thank you very much, Grant.
Chris, there's a question, sorry.
Sorry. Back you come.
Enormous thank you from the sector for representing all of us and every older Australian in getting a workable solution to aged care which is sustainable. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you for that contribution, Rachel.
Chris, just one sec, sorry.
Sorry?
Grant, just before you go, I just had a question around the move to the rental-only model. For providers in regional areas, how would the move to the rental model ensure there's capital going to stay in regional areas if we get rid of RADs and that sort of system?
Is this working? Yeah. Well, two things. One of the recommendations, of course, is thin markets, and we believe there has to be block funding in addition to the funding in thin markets. We recognise that it's so important in regional and rural areas, and to make certain that keep them viable. So that's as a general rule. The rule of RADs is really contingent. We talked about in 2030 we're going to have an independent review. I look at sustainability two ways. There's sustainability as the sector now stands, and we need these, I think these recommendations have to be enacted. But then there's sustainability to move to a rental system, which is a higher level of sustainability. So that's going to be looked at in 2030. Fundamentally, one of the big issues in the moment, so I think it's a fair way off, to be quite honest, but fundamentally one of the big issues is consumers don't know how much it costs for aged care. It changes so much. So imagine a world if we can get to this place where we say, your direct care, you've assessed for direct care, it's taxpayer funded. Great. Now, we've got a rental model, which has got to, again, be profitable and sustainable. A rental model where it says, I go to that home and for $140 a day, you get everything. You get all your meals, you get your accommodation, I know exactly what it costs. And it'll go to this home, it might be $150. A regional home, it might be $110. They'll always have different models. That's where I see a vision for that. But we've got a long way to go between now and then. And that's why I'm saying to people, have it on the table, because I think a vision of a rental model is important, but let's get the sector sustainable now, because this will be the part of the contributions that lead to that area if we get to that area. But it's a good challenge for us to have.